In the case of Catholics, no reason to believe that in large numbers that Catholics are thinking like that. They still want the Catholic Church in a way that is not characteristic of a lot of people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious.
It's a common refrain across Canada today. Older Christians lament the closing of churches and the fading influence of religion. But does this declining image apply to the Catholic Church? Or is there another part of the story yet to be told? Enter Reginald Bibby, one of Canada's most respected sociologists, who recently conducted a major cross-Canada survey. The future is bright, he says, when you crunch the numbers on Canada's Catholics, vitality and hope in a new era, today on Subject Matters. Reginald Bibby, welcome to Subject Matters. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, there's a dominant view out there that Canada, which is historically a very Christian country, is now a secular society, that religion is on its last legs. It's only a matter of time before it dies out. But the book that you've written with Angus Reid has painted a very different picture, and we'll get into some of the details. But tell me, just off the bat, what was the great conclusion that you came to when you looked at the statistics?
Well, the biggest thing that that we've come to realize over a period of time, and I need to just back up a little bit and say, been monitoring social trends in Canada going back to the 1970s, and everything was pointing in the direction of secularization and things winding down. We were envisioning as social scientists trying to make sense of things that probably by around 2000 it would pretty much be all over. And we realize now, looking back, how naive we were. Not only are we finding there's a stable core of Canadians who continue to value faith, but one of the biggest factors that I'm sure we'll get into is the reality of immigration that has just simply done wonders in terms of invigorating religion in Canada.
Before we do get into some of the details which are fascinating in the book, how is it possible that the secularists got it so wrong? Have you thought about that?
Well, it's an important question. Americans like Peter Berger, Harvey Cox also were predicting back in the 60s and 70s that religion pretty much would, if not be over, certainly be something practiced by a small minority by the end of the century. And they basically were recanting as we moved toward 2000. They were realizing that they were wrong as well. And it just seems that, particularly in Canada, that the primary reason that I think we blew it, I'd say that personally myself, looking back at projections I was making even in the early 1990s, is that we simply were minimizing, not understanding the importance of immigration and what worldwide developments as far as religion, as far as things going on, as far as with respect to religion, the impact that those developments would have on a country like Canada.
Let me ask you a little bit about methodology. So much of your data in the book comes from a March 2015 survey that you conducted with the Angus Reid Institute, but tell me a little bit about the approach that you took with the survey.
Well, the survey, as with so many national surveys now that are being carried out, was done using a panel of people. The panel is some 100,000 plus people. From that large number of people is sampling of something like, in our case, 3,000, 3,100 people. That sample was drawn from the large panel. So it's done online, and at the end of the day, the argument is that in a social and demographic sense, the sample is highly representative of Canadians, so that we can say with confidence that when we're making statements, we are generalizing with accuracy to the Canadian population as a whole. With respect to Catholics specifically, roughly 1,100 of the people of the over 3,000 in the overall sample, around 1,100 Roman Catholics as such.
And we can't talk about Catholicism in Canada without talking about the reality of Quebec, which is very interesting. This is the historic cradle of Canadian Catholicism. There's some fascinating numbers in the book about religiosity in Quebec, that participation is way down, involved with the institutional church. But I think you mentioned 75% of the population is still quote unquote Catholic. How do you look at Quebec and where do you place Quebec in this whole area?
Well, Quebec is really quite fascinating because the vast majority of observers, certainly in Canada and outside of Canada, when they look at Quebec, they essentially gauge the vitality as far as religion on service attendance. And you're right, Gallup in the 1960s claimed that something like 85% of Quebecers had attended Mass in the previous 7 days. 85%, down to around maybe 10 to 15% currently. That might be generous. The obvious assumption of people is that Catholicism has pretty much had it in Quebec. And it's intriguing to watch groups like evangelical Protestants who think that they can go in and they can mop up because after all, these people are not religious any longer. And of course, as all of us know, where the enigma lies is the fact that the vast majority of those people go on thinking they're Catholic. And we found again at the Christmas time when we look at the data with respect to people showing up, Catholics in Quebec or among Catholics across the country who come out of the woodwork. When we ask Catholics in our surveys, and we have, doing a large number of surveys over a period of time, would you be open to the idea of being involved in a different religious tradition? And what's fascinating there is that among weekly attending Catholics, to no one's surprise, something like 97% have said no. But among those who attend less, the figure is something like 95%. Right. So they go on thinking they're Catholic. We playfully in our book talk about them sticking like glue. So the dilemma that, probably a good news, I was going to head to the dilemma, but the good news for Roman Catholic leaders is the fact that they've still got those people in Quebec. The vast majority go on thinking they're Catholic. The dilemma lies, of course, in the fact that while they see themselves as Catholic, they're not interested, it seems, in showing up very often for services. But no one else is nabbing them in large numbers, precisely because they continue to think that they're Catholic. And by the way, when we look at some measures beyond talking about just involvement, we talk about things like beliefs. Belief in God, belief in life after death, belief in a guardian angel, those kinds of beliefs are alive and well among Quebec Catholics. And more personal things, for example, people believing that they're strengthened as a result of their faith. Those figures are also very high among Catholics in Quebec. So to look at Quebec from the standpoint of, again, of being a Catholic leader, is to see, I think, a lot of good news. But to the extent that leaders want to see Catholics more involved, that obviously is the problem that they're facing.
We have to take a short break, but we'll be back with much more with Reginald Bibby discussing Canada's Catholics. Stay with us. Reginald Bibby is one of Canada's most distinguished and well-known academics. Over the past 4 decades, he has been monitoring social trends in Canada through a series of national surveys, in the process gathering pioneering and historic data on religion and young people. He holds the Board of Governors Research Chair in the Department of Sociology at the University of Lethbridge. In 2006, the Governor General appointed him an Officer of the Order of Canada. We see here another example of the paradox that characterizes so many of Canada's Catholics. They continue to see themselves as Catholics. They are not rejecting religion. They are not about to turn elsewhere. The anomaly is not that they seem to want much, but rather that they seem to want so little. It is a difficult reality for a church that aspires to instill commitment and participation. Welcome back. We're here with Reginald Bibby discussing his book, Canada's Catholics, Vitality and Hope in a New Era. And Reg, I wanted to ask you, before the break there, we were talking about how Catholics in Quebec, but not only in Quebec, understand themselves today, that they don't necessarily belong to the institutional church in terms of going to Mass every Sunday or being involved in official gatherings or whatever, but it's very important for them in name to be Catholic. They still remain to be Catholic. And I'm just wondering, what does that say about how these nominal Catholics in Canada understand what it means to be Catholic?
Well, I don't know that in terms of content they understand very much about what it means to be Catholic. But when it comes to certain things like rites of passage, they certainly have a sense, the vast majority, that a child needs to be baptized. Contrary to rumor, we've been finding in our national surveys of young people, that the vast majority still plan to marry. Even if they're going to cohabit along the way, they're still at some point going to marry, and at that point they want the church brought in. And those figures, by the way, come in at over 85% of people, wow, I'm saying, planning to marry. And obviously funerals. We've asked Canadians pointedly, including Catholics, you know, about their own thoughts, their intentions when they die. And the vast majority of Catholics obviously want the church brought in. So there's a desire for rites of passage. What's intriguing is to find that the identification with Catholicism is often sometimes a bit latent. If someone's on a plane and someone's making a crack about the Pope, amazing how many Catholics come out of the woodwork and realize, you know, that's not, you know, letting people know that's they're not exactly happy with that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so we're saying it's a latent thing that becomes very, very obvious at certain times. The rites of passage, but also special services during the year. But I've found for people who are detractors, and will say, well, they're just cultural Catholics, and this the faith doesn't mean much to them, would argue very much that when it comes to other things that are very personal, for example, private prayer, that the vast majority of Catholics indicate that they're praying privately at least once a month, for example. And as I said, when we're talking beliefs, beliefs are nicely in place for large numbers of Catholics. So it's not, and I can't emphasize enough, when we ask them pointedly about, again, the openness to leave Catholicism behind, we don't find very many people that are about to abandon Catholicism at all.
Right, that's so interesting. Let's talk specifically about immigration, which you mentioned in the first segment of the show. This is, as you say, at one point, I think, the key factor for understanding the development of Catholicism, not only in Canada but globally. It's affecting everything, religiosity in general, even beyond the Catholic Church. But what do you see as like when you look at the numbers, what is immigration doing to Catholicism in Canada?
Well, what a lot of people aren't aware of is the fact that globally Catholicism is thriving. And if we're looking at numbers, we're looking at where most of the Catholics in the world are. You know, we're no longer looking, of course, at Europe and places like North America. We're talking about Latin America, we're talking about Asian countries, we're talking about African countries. And because of the acceleration of immigration that's taking place in Canada now, because a lot of people would say, well, we've always had immigration, and obviously we have, and it's been a major source of new Catholics in Canada. But because of the population, demographic problems in Canada, where we can't any longer sustain our population without having heavy immigration, we're just not having enough kids to offset deaths.
Right.
And as a result, we're already into a phase, Stats Canada tells us, where we have to have tremendous growth in terms of immigration just to sustain Canada's population, let alone see the population grow. So we connect our dots. The vast majority of people who are coming to Canada are coming precisely from countries where Catholicism has been thriving. So that we see a situation where, for example, in the last 10 years, there have been no less than around 500,000 people arriving in Canada as Catholics. You think of any religious denomination in Canada and what they would give to have those kinds of additions.
Yeah, really.
And we've got some major Protestant groups, for example, that don't even number 500,000. Right. But we're saying, apart from the number of Catholics here in the last decade or so, 500,000 new Catholics. Every reason to believe that that pace is going to continue. So it means that the growth as far as sheer numbers of, as far as Catholics in Canada, is really going to be something over the next few decades.
Let's look at a very interesting question, which is how Catholics understand some of the contentious moral issues that our society is dealing with. And I'm thinking specifically of things like abortion, which is a hot button issue. Euthanasia is absolutely a key issue in Canada today. And what you discovered, it comes out in the book, is that Catholics have very differing opinions about some of these issues, which seem like, I think it was up to the church, would say these are non-negotiable. I mean, the church is very much categorically against, for example, euthanasia or abortion. What does that say about the dynamic of Canadian Catholics, that there's this diversity of opinion?
Well, really a dilemma for someone who's not grown up as a Catholic, looking on and trying to make sense of this. You know, I find, for example, that it's incredibly perplexing. A Protestant, for example, who doesn't agree with the teachings of the church simply would cease to be a Protestant,
right.
and would not bother showing up. So it's intriguing to look on and see people who say that they're Catholic, they value being a Catholic, they're not going to turn anywhere else, but when it comes to things like expecting them to show up on a regular basis, they're really not interested in doing that. And then when we look at basic, as you say, you know, non-negotiable kinds of teachings relating to things like abortion, but relating to other areas, for example, homosexuality, looking at just the reality of sex outside marriage. The fact of the matter is that in terms of those teachings, a simple way to sum it up, as we have been for a number of years, is that Canadian Catholics are into religion a la carte, and they're interested in a, you know, in a teaching here and a teaching there. But when it comes to areas relating generally to sexuality, Catholics pretty much want to operate on their own terms. And again, what's intriguing is most other Canadians, if they didn't agree with those kinds of moral teachings, they just simply leave the church. Right. Catholics, you know, frustrate their leaders by saying, I'm not leaving the church, I'm a Catholic, and the church is going to have to change before I'm going to leave.
So what's the response? What do the religious leaders, the bishops especially, across the country, how should they be looking at this, and what should they be doing to say, here's how we reach out?
And I'm supposed to answer that in just a few minutes, a few seconds. I keep going back to the basic good finding, and that's that these people still consider themselves Catholics. They still value being Catholics, even if they're having lots of difficulty accepting specific teachings as far as the Catholic faith. And I've suggested, I've had the opportunity to speak to bishops on a number of occasions, and we seem to at least agree on one basic thing. They're still there. I mean, playfully have said, you know, it's sort of like they're still somewhere on the field. And I've had one bishop say, yeah, but I don't want them just out in the field. I want to bring them home. And I'm saying at least the good news is that you're not losing them, I keep saying. The trick there is Catholics, leaders, trying to figure out what in fact is negotiable. What are the kinds of things that they're willing to live with, given the fact that a lot of Catholics obviously don't agree with official church teachings. What's new there? But I still keep insisting you still have them. If Catholics decide, look, we're just not going to allow these people to have anything to do with us, if leaders had that approach, the fact of the matter is I don't know where these people would be going. They're not showing any openness to trying all kinds of, you know, various alternatives. We hear a lot of cliches about Canadians increasingly being spiritual but not religious, for example. In the case of Catholics, no reason to believe that in large numbers that Catholics are thinking like that. They still want the Catholic Church in a way that is not characteristic of a lot of people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious.
Fascinating. We have a guest reviewer today. David Seljak is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at St. Jerome's University. David.
In their new book, Canada's Catholics, Vitality and Hope in a New Era, Reginald Bibby and Angus Reid attempt to do the impossible. Inject some optimism into the Roman Catholic Church in Canada. Bibby and Reid argue that the religious glass in Canada is half full, not half empty. In fact, a little more than half full. They divide the Canadian population into three parts. People who have left religion altogether, a larger group who have remained faithful to their religion, and the largest group, people who are sitting on the fence, the great fat middle. They argue that the church has to approach these people. They use cold marketing language to say that the religious demand is out there, it's up to the religious suppliers to draw these people in. People are no longer going to go to church because someone told them to, especially not their parents or their bishop. Now, this optimism that is presented in this book is supplemented by a wide variety of easy-to-read charts and graphs. This is a book that anyone could read, and I would argue all Catholics should read in order to get a fair picture of what's going on in their church and in their country. Now, this can't be an academic book review unless I raise a question for my friend Reg, and so this is my question. I know a lot of sociologists of religion who would dispute Reginald Bibby's optimism in this book. They would say the reason why Bibby sees a case of religious polarization, that is, people who have rejected religion and people who have accepted and stayed religious, is that he has taken a snapshot rather than a video. If he took a video of the Canadian situation, what he'd find is that people who have accepted religion and are staying religious are slowly drifting over into that big fat middle, and people in that big fat middle are slowly dripping over into the no religion category. So are we really in a moment of polarization, Reg? Or really are we looking at a process of secularization that is passing through a phase of polarization? Is polarization today really just a step towards secularization tomorrow?
Okay, thank you very much, David. Well, very interesting observations there. Reg, considering the trends that are taking place, you talk about this reality of polarization and secularization. Is the current state of polarization today merely a step towards secularization tomorrow?
Oh, don't think so at all. The old model was to think in terms of secularization, people being religious and increasingly moving away from religion. Though what we're documenting, I think rather thoroughly in the book and in work since then, is the fact that we have a core of people in Canada who value faith. And we have a core of people, as we all know, who don't, and the large majority of people probably in the middle somewhere. Thanks primarily to immigration, we're going to find all kinds of vitality with respect to that core of people who are valuing faith. That core is not going to be diminishing. If anything, some organizations like the well-known Pew Forum research organization in the U.S. is predicting by 2050, the fact is that the percentage of Canadians who are going to be identifying themselves as having no religion basically will be unchanged from where it is right now. And that's primarily because, again, of the revitalization that religion is experiencing as a result of immigration. So no, not just a phase. We're going to continue to have a solid core of people who value faith.
Does that mean that people who are non-believers, or this growth of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S as we call them, is not developing, or is it kind of stagnant? Where is that going?
It actually is. It's being offset largely, by again the large number of people who are coming to Canada who do value faith. If we were to isolate Catholics and others, for example, who are born outside of Canada versus those born in Canada, no comparison with respect to the levels of weekly attendance, involvement in the church, the valuing of faith as a whole. So people who are watching this and are thinking, yeah, but I know so many people who aren't valuing religion anymore, and there's no question, the research points to the fact there's a solid core of Canadians, maybe 1 in 3, who are saying that they have no interest in religion. But what's often lost in that is there's still about 1 in 3 who do say they value faith, and the people in the middle are not particularly inclined toward the no religion end of the continuum. In fact, a lot of those people in the middle, when we actually ask them to identify themselves as far as that continuum, are people, for example, who are Catholics in Quebec, where they're recognizing that there are things they don't like about about faith, but at the same time, they're not about to leave, as I keep saying.
Let's take one more break, but when we come back, some concluding remarks from Reginald Bibby. Stay with us. Canada's Catholics, Vitality and Hope in a New Era is published by Novalis and is available for purchase at novalis.ca and at Ben McNally Books in Toronto.
In the course of putting the book together, one of the things that was obvious to both of us is the fact that we both value Christian faith. And when we thought in terms of dedication, natural was to recognize the people who have been particularly important in terms of our coming to value faith. For Angus, his parents, Lorna and Ernest, Reed, and for me, Bud and Roberta Bibby, my mom and my dad.
A significant development has been the tendency for people who do not value religion to say so. Individuals openly acknowledge that they are not religious. Some are very vocal about their atheism. That said, many such people have been getting a lot of ink, leading to an exaggeration of the multitude of such leanings. It seems clear that what we are seeing is not so much the rejection of religion as the emergence of an explicit kind of polarization. A solid core of people value faith and a solid core do not, with a significant number of Canadians somewhere in between. Reg, I want to ask you about the Francis effect. Francis burst onto the scene in 2013, totally changed the narrative of Catholicism around the world. How has that impacted the Catholic population in Canada?
Sure. My co-author Angus Reid has actually been probing some of the issues relating to the impact that Francis has had on Canadian Catholics. The good news is that in terms of PR, obviously the effect has been very, very positive. People feeling very good about Francis, feeling better about the church, and Angus has got into some specific kinds of things, the concern about poverty on the one hand, but also, you know, wanting the church leaders to perhaps be a little less lavish with some of their own expenditures and concerns. And then when issues relating to compassion toward people who are gay, and these kinds of issues, Catholics applauding all those kinds of things for the most part. However, asterisk on that, when Angus gets down to the bottom line and says, well, has it so far at least made an impact with respect to your being more involved in the Catholic Church, the answer for the most part is no. But at least initially, good news. I mean, good news in terms of at least the PR part of this.
Was there anything that surprised you when you got the numbers back?
The biggest thing that I think surprised both of us was the fact that we really just expected it would be kind of business as usual, and things not looking that positive, and frankly, as we look into the future, would not be able to paint a very positive, exciting story as far as the Catholic Church in Canada. And I'd say dramatically that the fact of the matter is that what we have found is a lot of good news for Catholics in Canada. That we're finding for those who continue to identify themselves as Catholics, that there's much more life, there's much more valuing of faith than perhaps most of us actually had thought when we actually ask average Catholics, and that's of course what we've done in the survey. We've also though found that there's all kinds of reason for hope and vitality. As I were mentioning with respect to numbers, hope related to the vitality that is associated with the large number of people coming to Canada who see themselves as Catholics. Make no mistake about it, almost any religious group in Canada would love to be in the position of the Catholic Church, where without having to go out in the proverbial highways and byways and locate people, we're saying that people are arriving here really in the hundreds of thousands as Roman Catholics. And it means that Catholics have a tremendous opportunity to do significant things into the immediate future in Canada. So unlike the way things looked perhaps around 1990, we're saying a lot of good news in all of this for Roman Catholics in Canada.
Very bright picture. Reginald Bibby, thanks very much for sharing this insights with us. Incredible. Thank you. The book is Canada's Catholics, Vitality and Hope in a New Era by Reginald Bibby and Angus Reid. You can get it right here at Ben McNally Books in Toronto or online from Novalis. Just visit novalis.ca. Reg holds the Board of Governors Research Chair in Sociology at the University of Lethbridge. He's also an officer of the Order of Canada. He's written numerous books, including A New Day, The Resilience and Restructuring of Religion in Canada, and he's still writing, just published, Resilient Gods. Be sure to check that out. You can learn more about Reg and his excellent work at reginaldbibby.com. And be sure to take a look at the Angus Reid Institute, the public opinion research organization that made this book possible. Angus Reid is co-author of Canada's Catholics along with Reginald. And you can learn more about the Institute at angusreid.org. I want to thank David Seljak. He's Associate Professor of Religious Studies at St. Jerome's University, which is part of the University of Waterloo. And remember, if you'd like to see my video review of Canada's Catholics, Vitality and Hope in a New Era, visit our website, saltandlighttv.org/subjectmatters, and click on the episode page with Reg. And that's all the time we have for today, but thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon. Subject Matters with Sebastian Gomes is sponsored by the Cullen family. Our Salt and Light team works hard to bring you quality Catholic programming like Subject Matters. Please consider supporting our mission by making a donation today. Thank you for your generosity, and remember, our hope begins with you.